Hi, I'm Lisa Fletcher, and you're in the stream. Today, are we nearing an age where parents will be able to pick and choose their child's traits? We're talking about genetically modified babies. They already exist. The question is, are we heading down a path of disease prevention or engineering of the human race? Our digital producer, Malika Bilal, is here looking out for your live feedback. Malika, looking through the tweets all day today, and I'm seeing words like freaky and weird and like science fiction. It really is a little daunting to think about genetically engineering human beings.
You're right, Lisa, and so that's what we asked our community, a polling question, how they feel about picking the traits of their offspring. And the conversation looked a little something like this. Jackie on Facebook says, no, we should accept our children as they are. And Salman says, of course I would. Everybody wants their child to be perfect. So, of course, during the course of the show, we'll talk about what perfection is, but this is a live conversation, so we want to hear from you. Send your thoughts using the hashtag AJStream.
And if you have a story you think we should cover, we want to hear from you. You can connect with us directly at stream.aljazeera.com. Click About to see our team members' Twitter handles, including mine and Malika's. Here are some of the hashtags that you've been following. If you had the option, you might use genetic engineering to choose certain traits for your child, possibly manipulating the baby's genetic makeup to prevent things like cancer or Parkinson's disease. But would you stop there? Would you pick features like eye color, hair, height, intelligence? Science may be getting closer to that. The technology to create a three-parent baby from the DNA of a mother and a father plus another woman's DNA was just approved by the UK's Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. This science would prevent the mother from passing down a genetic condition called mitochondrial disease, which causes things like blindness, heart disorders, learning disabilities, even early death. Critics say this is the beginning of a slippery slope, leading to designer babies. They fear it will widen social divisions by equating genetic modification to superiority. So, how far should parents and doctors be able to go when it comes to creating genetically modified babies? And what moral and ethical implications would we face? Joining us to help answer these questions is Nita Farahani, professor of genome sciences and policy at Duke University. She is a leading scholar on the ethical, legal, and social implications of biosciences and emerging technologies. Also with us, Julian Savulescu, director of the Oxford Center for Neuroethics. His areas of research include predictive genetic testing and genetic enhancement. Stuart Newman is a professor of cell biology and anatomy at New York Medical College. He was a founding member of the Council for Responsible Genetics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And from Berkeley, California is Marcy Donofsky, executive director at the Center for Genetics and Society. She speaks and writes widely on the politics of human biotechnology and focuses on social justice and public interest implications. Welcome, everyone, to the stream. Julian, I want to start with you. Help us separate fact from fiction here. Right now, today, what are the scientists able to do in terms of human genetic modification, and what's available to parents?
Well, at the moment, you can select against major diseases such as Down syndrome or cystic fibrosis, and adult onset cancers such as breast and bowel cancer in the embryos that are produced after IVF. There are genes that have been associated with various behaviours, such as disposition to criminal or violent behaviour when coupled with early childhood deprivation, and genes associated with greater altruism. The Chinese have a very large program to look for many of these genes, contributors to intelligence, personality, traits, capabilities and gifts. At the moment, this is very infantile, but it opens the door to selecting for non-disease traits in offspring.
So, Julian, when you say right now we can select against, does that mean when you find it, you can genetically modify it, or does that just result in an abortion if the parent chooses that route?
At the moment, the only thing which is legal is selection between different embryos based on genetic testing. Modifying the genome or the DNA of embryos is illegal in virtually all jurisdictions in the world. But in principle, it's possible, and it's been done in non-human animals.
All right, so Stuart, fertility regulators in the UK have just paved the way for this introduction of what seems to be a fairly radical form of gene therapy in which babies are created using essentially the DNA from 3 people. Can you explain to us how that works and why somebody would do that?
Well, some women have mitochondria in their eggs. And mitochondria are the kind of energy extracting organelles, and they have their own DNA. And if that DNA is impaired, it can lead to very severe conditions in some cases. So if they have a naturally produced child, that child will be susceptible to these diseases. So the idea, according to the agencies that have been discussing it, is to replace the mitochondria of that woman with the mitochondria of a different person, a different woman usually. And a child gets all of its mitochondria in most cases from its mother. So that set of mitochondria, the replaced ones, will in general be the ones that are transmitted to the next generation, and they won't contain the impairment.
Stuart, is this what was done in New Jersey last year?
No, this is it wasn't last year. About 10 years ago or more, there were attempts to transfer by what's called cytoplasmic injection mitochondria from one woman's eggs into another woman's eggs, and that led to a number of different negative outcomes, and some where it wasn't demonstrated to be negative, but that was never fully approved in the United States.
Because you and I were reading that article this morning,
right,
which was, it took us both aback.
Right.
Right?
Knowing that it happened last year and none of us knew about it.
Yeah, 15 babies, right?
Right, exactly. Well, Nita, I want to go to you now because our community is weighing in on this, and the common theme that's coming up is that this isn't natural. There's a tweet here from Amr who says, I would choose a partner based on traits I'd like my kids to have, but never use genetic engineering to do it. It lacks naturalism. And another from Becca Delia who says, it would have been God's work. He did a far better job than I would have. Some traits I never would have thought to ask for. So the argument about whether or not it's natural, are you persuaded by that, Nita?
Not particularly, unfortunately. It seems to me that many people try to use this naturalness argument to argue against any new technology. And the truth is, almost everything we've done in modern medicine has been our attempts to try to correct the imperfections in nature. So if a person gets sick, we give them antibiotics. If a person becomes ill enough, we can perform surgery on them. The natural course of things would be for those people to die, and yet we nevertheless think that modern medicine is quite effective and quite a good thing. So these types of arguments to me are largely just fear of unknown rather than a true objection against progress in science.
Nita, do you get concerned, though, where something technologically could start out as a good and well-intentioned thing where we are preventing these terrible diseases, but then it gets to the point, like we were talking about a few minutes ago, designer babies where people are choosing for eye color and hair color and intellect and height?
Well, so first of all, people are already doing many of those things. They choose their mates sometimes in part on how they look and what their traits are, and they're seeking to actually have children with people who they think are genetically compatible and physically compatible with what they hope for. And already in IVF clinics, when couples are given the option to select between different embryos, they're already selecting for far more than just the disease traits. But all of that doesn't answer your question directly. Your question is it going to get out of hand? And it could. It could get out of hand unless we have a transparent way forward, unless we engage the public, have a public debate about where we think we can draw the line. The idea that we can never draw a line before we get to some dystopia, to me, is just fear-mongering.
Well, you mentioned imperfection. There's a tweet here from D. Fox who kind of picks up on that. He says, it's awesome as some hereditary diseases can be eradicated, but a generation of perfect kids is boring. No one will innovate anymore. But that idea of imperfection versus perfection and what that is, Uche on Twitter says, whenever we try to play God, there are always unforeseeable and regrettable repercussions. This is the ethics of genetic engineering. And Marcy, I want to pose that to you. Is this playing God?
Well, when I hear about that, I worry more about the playing part than I worry about the God part. I think that we haven't really known what we're doing when we've tried to do much, much simpler forms of gene transfer, and a lot of people have been harmed as a result. And I think when I hear people talking about advocating these sorts of procedures, I often hear them saying, X is no different than Y, when I think, apples are very different from bowling balls. So choosing a mate based on characteristics you'd like to see in your child is very, very different than trying to manipulate genes that you'll pass down to every cell in the body of your child and all subsequent generations after that. These are two very different things. And people have been looking at this question for some time, and they have found a place to draw a line. And the line is against the manipulation of the genes we pass on to future generations. As Julian pointed out, that's the line that's been drawn in dozens of countries. In every country that has policy on this kind of genetic engineering, the kind that is inheritable, that's what the decision has been. And that's why there's concern about this mitochondrial technique that would, in a way, cross that line. Now, it's really different from other kinds of hereditary diseases. Genetic engineering of future children isn't at all necessary for them. The mitochondrial issue is a tiny, tiny exception with a very small number of people who would be affected, and they do have alternatives for having healthy children.
Julian, how do we know, or do we know, that preventing one disorder or one disease through genetic modification isn't going to lead to something else that's problematic?
Well, of course you don't. It's exactly right that there's a lot of uncertainty. But it's important to realise that doing nothing is also committing yourself to risks and chances. And I agree with Marcia that we should be very reluctant to play around with the genome of human beings. But, we try to cure diseases. Gene therapies have been attempted for major diseases with admittedly very limited results. And I think we should be cautious. But we can only do science and try to predict the benefits and the risks. Sometimes people say that, we should leave things to nature. I think, as Nita said, leaving things to nature has very serious downsides. At some point, you have to make a decision whether you're going to jump in the water. You want to estimate the depth and see how far it is to swim, but it would be irrational just to remain on the bank under all conditions.
But then does it become a race across the pond between scientists, and we sort of maybe put some of the ethical concerns aside because everybody wants to lead the progress?
I think one of the things that you're seeing is a crisis of ethics today. Many people don't accept the traditional ethics and norms that were inherited from religion. And I think, as Nita said, we need some new sets of goals, some lines, and that line should be based on the welfare and well-being of the child concerned. If you're aiming for something that not just prevents a disease in the child, but aims at that child having a better life, rather than constructing some super race as the Nazis wanted to do, I think that's a good place to start. And it's quite clear that it's not only diseases that affect how our lives go, but other capacities or inabilities. And it's a brute fact that people are different. Not everyone is born gifted or talented or advantaged, and that can have profound impact on people's chances in life.
Well, Stuart, we have a video comment here talking about the distinction between, using genetic selection and engineering to take away disabilities and using it for other purposes. Have a listen.
When we talk about genetically engineering children, I think it's important to remember the difference between engineering to avoid genetic defects, hereditary diseases, things that really affect quality of life, and things like hair color, eye color, skin color that are more about cosmetics than anything else. I think the one is probably pretty morally defensible, and the other one not as much.
So, Stuart, is there a distinction?
Well, there's a distinction when it comes to selection. If you're selecting among embryos that have been produced by in vitro fertilization, you can do selections against disease, but you can do selections for traits that might be desirable if you can predict them. I just want to point out that the whole thing is, in the discussion so far, those who have framed it as let nature take its course or do something at all, it just doesn't really correspond to what scientists know about this. When you do these genetic manipulations, particularly these mitochondrial ones that have been proposed, you're taking little bits of one cell and blending it together with bits of another cell. These are damaged cells that you're putting together, and you're basically hoping for the best because all the genes are there. There's some false idea that's goes around that the genes contain a program to produce the organism, so as long as the genes are there, then everything will take care of itself. And any scientist who does experiments on animals, as I do, and does genetic manipulations, knows that these things most of the time don't go the way you expect. And if they go the way you expect 70 or 80% of the time, you can publish it, and then that gets into the scientific literature. But how many people would want to subject their future children to a technique that may or may not work and is almost as likely to lead to a bad outcome as it is to a good outcome?
Nita, that raises an interesting point, which is ethically, what right do doctors and parents have to subject their unborn children to these lab experiments?
I think that there are two separate issues that have to be addressed to answer that question. The first one is the technological hurdle, which is, can we show that there are safe and effective ways of accomplishing genetic engineering? And with mitochondrial transfer, the reason that the HFEA has suggested that the UK move forward with those techniques is because there is substantial data to show that it is safe and efficacious. Once you've decided that, once you know that a technique is safe and efficacious, you have to ask a second question, which is, are there ethical limits on the types of engineering or the types of changes that you might be willing to make to a genome? So the comments about differences between therapeutic interventions versus cosmetic interventions, other types of things people are, debating today. But I think we have to start with, is it safe and is it effective? If it is, then I think we need to have the conversation about whether or not parents and doctors can proceed ahead with, providing individuals with better outcomes, providing them with less of a risk of terrible and debilitating diseases, and providing them options for a better life.
Earlier today, we spoke with Dr. Santiago Monet. He's the founder and the director of Reproduction. That's a genetics laboratory that provides embryonic testing to parents throughout the United States, Europe, Japan, South America. We asked him where genetic engineering was headed. Here's what he said.
What is going to happen is that we'll have more and more techniques that will already allow us to select for more diseases. So right now, it would take us probably 6 months to sequence a whole embryo and get all the information that is in that embryo. And this will help, for instance, in the epidemic of autism that we have now. And if we can select those diseases, then we'll be able to prevent them. And everybody would have access to this information, everybody that pays for the procedure, of course.
I know, Julian, that we're speaking somewhat hypothetically here, but realistically, who would be able to afford this?
Well, initially, whole genome analysis will be very expensive, but as time goes on, the costs will come down, and essentially, the costs of IVF will also come down. So it's a question of how much is it subsidised by the government. In countries like the United Kingdom, where there's a national health service, there will be an increasing imperative for the government to support this sort of testing, because natural reproduction is both inefficient and unsafe. Only 1 in 5 embryos naturally produce a baby, and 5% of those have some abnormality. So as this kind of technology becomes both more efficient and is able to pick up more and more diseases, it will actually become superior to natural reproduction in terms of producing even healthy babies. And once you've got that information, you will also be able to look at the rest of the genetic profile. It's fair to say that your options for choice will be very limited by the number of embryos that you have. So it'll be essentially limited to diseases, but the information about hair colour, eye colour, etc., insofar as they have a genetic contribution, will be available.
I just want to clarify something. In all of that answer, you said basically eventually natural reproduction will not be the way to go. Does that mean everybody's going to eventually be created in a petri dish?
Well, not obviously around the world. That's not a viable option. But at the moment, only a small fraction of pregnancies are by assisted reproduction. But many people, particularly as they get older, as women get older now and want to have a career, are having more and more difficulty having a baby naturally. And there is no reason to believe that science won't do better than natural reproduction. At the moment, pregnancy rates are about the same using frozen eggs after vitrification as normal pregnancy rates, are 1 in 5 embryos. And there's reason to suspect that will improve as the technologies improve.
Marcy, I know you want to jump in.
I do. One thing I want to underline for people is that there really is an enormous difference between selecting embryos. There's still lots of ethical questions. Do you select for hair color, skin color, as some would advocate, including Julian, or not? But that's a very different matter than actually manipulating the genes. Then you come into the extreme safety questions, and what you're doing in the pursuit of a healthy baby is giving yourself the likelihood that you're going to have a very unhealthy child. And the second thing is that those who have looked at this are concerned precisely because we may be heading toward a new eugenics, precisely because these are expensive procedures that will be available to the wealthy. And if those wealthy people who use these techniques have children who either are or who are said to be superior in one way or another, as even the advocates of these technologies say, we could be heading toward a world of new kinds of inequality, a world of genetic castes. That's the term of an advocate of these techniques. I don't think we want to go there. And I do think it's a kind of new eugenics. The Nazis wanted to select and engineer for certain kinds of traits. And this is a new kind of eugenics. Because it's high tech, doesn't make it not eugenics.
Well, Nita, I saw you shaking your head there, but our community is picking up on something that Julian raised. And he said, pretty soon many people will have the option, but our community is asking, is that really true? And what does this say about class stratification? There's a tweet here from Faraz who says, we're asking the wrong question. Class divide could be the circumstantial outcome of misusing any product, not the product itself. But then on the other hand, you have a tweet from Wahid who says, I guess only the wealthy will become smarter and innovative. Will this create the 21st century of peasant and noble?
So these are all interesting questions. They all, I think, make a number of fundamental mistakes. The first one is we're not talking about state-sponsored eugenics here. We're talking about private individuals making private choices, and all of the surveys and research with parents to date show they're not looking to have a child who has blonde hair and blue eyes and looks totally different than them. They want children who are healthy, who look like them, and to have an open future to be able to flourish and live a healthy life. So the idea of state-sponsored eugenics as the kind of mechanism to getting to this dystopia, to me, is just a way to scare people from avoiding what could be incredibly useful science. But on the haves and have-nots, it's true that every new technological innovation we have has the potential to increase divides between those who are wealthy and those who are not. And as Julian said, one of the questions that we have to ask with any technology, including this one, is to what extent will there be state subsidization?
Nita, I'm going to stop you. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you right there because we're about out of time, but we will pick up right where we left off in the post-show. So everyone, please join us at stream.aljazeera.com. Now on tomorrow's program, sectarian violence in Egypt. It's claimed the lives of nearly 60 Coptic Christians over the last 2 years. With renewed clashes between Muslims and Christians, we examine the roots of sectarianism in post-Mubarak Egypt. I'm Lisa Fletcher. Welcome to the Stream's online post show. Today we've been discussing genetically engineered babies and why some believe it should be prohibited. We're also asking, would you use genetic engineering to prevent hereditary diseases and maybe even choose certain traits for your kids? Still with us are Nita Farahani, Julian Savulescu, Stuart Newman, and Marcia Dornovsky. Nita, I want to pick up where you left off. You were talking about these increasing divides and how genetic engineering may or may not contribute to that.
Well, I was saying that I think that every technology has the potential to increase the divide because wealth enables individuals access to technology, to education, to vitamins, to prenatal care, to all sorts of things that give their children advantages over other children. So this isn't new or novel in that way. What's new or novel is the fact that people equate the ability to do some sort of genetic intervention with genetic determinism. They assume that if we're able to give children some different traits through genetic engineering, that necessarily means that you have a perfect child. There's no such thing as perfection. Genetic engineering won't get us there. It may give some children some benefits, which leads to a broader societal question about what kind of state subsidization and what can we do to increase the availability and access to other individuals.
Julian, speaking of that, state subsidization, I'm not even going to try to repeat it, twice is it for me. The role of government. What is the role of government potentially down the road with this?
Yeah, the role of government is twofold. Firstly, to prevent people from choosing certain kinds of traits that may be disadvantageous to the child or to society more generally, but also to encourage and support selection of those traits that really make a difference to that child's life prospects. So, for example, impulse control. Attention deficit disorder is a disorder that's been invented to enable medical treatment of people at one end of a normal spectrum. And the reason for that is that inability to control impulses really is disabling. It leads to very poor educational outcomes, very poor prospects for jobs, and you're likely to end up in prison. So poor impulse control is not a disease. It's an end of a spectrum. If you're able to improve that through genetic selection or through drug therapy, as Ritalin and Adderall aim at doing, or through genetic interventions that were safe, that would have a profound benefit for those individuals concerned, as profound as the treatment of some diseases.
Well, Lisa, at the beginning of the show, you mentioned that some of this is delving into what many of our community believes to be the realm of science fiction.
Yeah.
There's a tweet here from Asad Beg. He says, we're going to end up choosing every last detail of children. Are we going to end up with a master race? And I want to direct that to you, Stuart. Is that a possibility? It sounds funny right now, but, there's also a Facebook comment here from Andy who picks up on that. And he says, my question would be, where would you stop? While in some ways this technology would be wonderful in the fight against disease, et cetera, like many of our guests here today are saying, my concern would be, Andy goes on to say, what is the limit? Just because we can, does that mean we should?
I would take issue with the idea that we can. I think it's been said in this discussion that these techniques have been shown to be safe and efficacious. They've been shown to be safe and efficacious in mice and sometimes in monkeys. And we expect less from mice and monkeys. If they turn out to be not exactly what they should be, we might even miss it. Whenever you go from one species to another with a set of manipulative techniques, there are always new problems that emerge. There's never, ever been a case where you've been able to transfer a technology from one species to another without doing a whole slew of experiments to optimize it. So what people are proposing who advocate this are just doing experiments on prospective human beings to see where it might differ from what happens in mice or monkeys, and then after a while, maybe 20, 30 years of experimenting on other people's embryos, maybe some scientists would try it on their own family's embryos. This is really very misguided. It's totally wrong to take prospective people and treat them as if they were patients or something. Medicine is to cure people who are ill, people who are impaired, to save lives, not to create new kinds of lives.
All All right. On that note, my sincere thanks to all of our guests. Thank you for an incredibly informative and robust discussion today. On Tuesday, sectarian violence in Egypt has claimed the lives of nearly 60 Coptic Christians over the last 2 years. With renewed clashes between Muslims and Christians, we're going to examine the roots of sectarianism in post-Mubarak Egypt and what some activists are doing to fight religious discrimination. So send us your thoughts and your comments on that. And until then, we'll see you online.